Right, working now? We ready to start? Okay. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for coming to the UVU Conference on Mental Health. This session will conclude at 11:15 a.m. Our session is titled Healing Relational Trauma, and our presenter for this session is Victoria Sanders. Victoria is a licensed marriage and family therapist who is licensed in both California and Utah and owns VMS Family Counseling Services, a group practice that provides treatment and services to individuals, families, and couples. Victoria specializes in the treatment of foster and adopted children, focusing on the way interpersonal and relational trauma impacts individuals in a unique way that must be treated in an evidence-based manner. Victoria is an adjunct faculty at CSU Fresno in their MFCC department and seeks to provide training and support to new generations of therapists.
Now can you hear me? Yay, you can hear me. Good morning. My name is Vicki. As he mentioned, I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist in Fresno, California. I am licensed here in Utah. As you can imagine, all of my work here in Utah is done remotely, so I do not see a lot of very young children. But my primary area of focus is working with children and families who've experienced relational trauma. And so that's what we're going to be talking about today. Most of what I'm going to tell you, well, everything that I'm going to tell you has some basis in research and practice, but everyone has differences of opinions. So, as we go along, I may give you some different ideas that different people have. I really enjoy speaking, and I feel like this is a super important concept to discuss because most people have this idea that as long as we can't remember it, then it never happened. And that's absolutely 100% not true. And so even therapists, up until about the early 2000s, used to tell parents, if your child is adopted and they don't remember, don't tell them. They will never know. Nothing bad will ever happen to them. And then terrible things happened. So, because it is terrible. So we do remember a lot of things. But this is not the happiest of trainings, right? It's not the happiest of talks because we're talking about violence and how that impacts babies and children and parents and all of that stuff. So what I do want to say is, please, as we go through this beginning portion, know that there is hope for our future, our children, our adults. And so as we go through all of this, although it's a little bit sad sometimes, please know that there is hope for all of this. So Dr. Karen Purvis, who has unfortunately passed away, opened the Karen Purvis Institute. Well, it wasn't called the Karen Purvis Institute when she was alive, but through Texas Christian University, and she made the statement, relational trauma can only be healed through relationship. When I use the term relational trauma, we'll talk a little bit more about this, it includes that interpersonal violence because it's whenever we have violence that occurs in relationship, right? So it's not just normal trauma like an earthquake or a natural disaster. And so when we talk about relational trauma, I want to share with you why it is so important that we talk about the relationship between attachment and trauma and how we manage that. So if you have read the book, The Body Keeps the Score by Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, which I never pronounced correctly, you will have read this little story, but I'm going to read you a little story because I think it's helpful to notice what attachment does when trauma happens. On September 11th, 2001, 5-year-old Noam Saul witnessed the first passenger plane slam into the World Trade Center from the windows of his first grade classroom at PS 234, less than 1,500 feet away. He and his classmates ran with their teacher down the stairs to the lobby, where most of them were reunited with their parents who had dropped them off at school just moments before. Noam, his older brother, and their dad were 3 of the tens of thousands of people who ran for their lives through the rubble, ash, and smoke of Lower Manhattan that morning. 10 days later, I visited his family, who were friends of mine, and that evening, his parents and I went for a walk in the eerie darkness through the still smoking pit where Tower 1 once stood. making our way among the rescue crews who were working around the clock under the blazing lights. When we returned home, Noam was still awake, and he showed me a picture that he had drawn at 9 a.m. on September 12th. The drawing depicted what he had seen the day before: an airplane slamming into the tower, a ball of fire, firefighters, and people jumping from the tower's windows. But at the bottom of the picture, he had drawn something else: a black circle at the foot of the buildings. I had no idea what it was, so I asked him. "A trampoline," he replied. "What was a trampoline doing there?" Noam explained, "So that the next time that when people have to jump, they will be safe." I was stunned. This 5-year-old boy, a witness to unspeakable mayhem and disaster just 24 hours before he had made this drawing, had used his imagination to process what he had seen and begin to go on with his life. Noam was fortunate. His entire family was unharmed. He had grown up surrounded by love, and he was able to grasp that the tragedy they had witnessed had come to an end. During disasters, young children usually take their cues from their parents. As long as their caregivers remain calm and responsive to their needs, they often survive terrible incidents without serious psychological scars. But Noam's experience allows us to see and outline two critical aspects of the adaptive response to threat that is basic to human survival. At the time the disaster occurred, he was able to take an active role by running away from it, thus becoming an agent in his own rescue. And once he had reached the safety of his home, the alarm bells in his brain and body quieted. This freed his mind to make some sense of what had happened and even to imagine a creative alternative to what he had seen, a life-saving trampoline. So if we imagine our fetus, our baby who's not born yet, and babies in the first 2 years of life whose mothers and fathers are experiencing interpersonal violence in their home, they cannot do either of those things. They cannot run away, and they do not have a time when those alarm bells turn off. And so that is why when we talk about relational trauma and how it impacts someone throughout the lifespan, we really begin to understand that it is not just about an event. It is not just about a singular event that occurred. It is about this lifelong process of not being able to keep themselves safe and not being able to quiet those alarm bells. So today we're going to discuss the difference between interpersonal violence and child abuse and how the two intersect. Again, we tend to think very black and white. I remember being in graduate school when I was working on my master's in counseling, and everything seemed very simple. Everything was black and white. There were rules that you followed. There were things that happened. Unfortunately, the world does not always go along the same track. We're going to discuss what relational trauma really means, what we're talking about. We're going to identify how viewing interpersonal violence during childhood impacts an individual throughout the lifespan, and that includes violence that occurred before birth. Again, this is sometimes somewhat difficult for people to grasp. Things that happened before we were born, how does that possibly impact us? And we're going to talk about that. And then finally, we're going to talk about why it's important that we understand this and how we can work through and manage treatment for this. So, if you have been in any child development classes in your life, you have heard of Erik Erikson and his stages of development. So let's talk about, for just a second, the first two. Now, he doesn't discuss prenatal time period, so we'll discuss that later. But between 0 and 1 years old, the child's job is to did I turn that off? No? Okay. To decide whether they can trust the world or whether they must mistrust the world. Their jobs are to figure out things like, do I have hope? Can I trust what's happening around me? So when I cry, does someone come for me? When I'm hungry, does someone feed me? Because between 0 and 1, I actually don't know what I need. I need someone else to do that for me. In terms of regulation, we term this a time period when someone needs other regulation. We need someone else to fully regulate us because we have no way to regulate ourselves. I was lucky to spend time living and working in Romania, and I will tell you that the quietest place I've ever been was in an orphanage with 90 babies that were under the age of 2, because none of them cried. There was 3 nurses on staff at any given time. No one came for them if they cried, so they stopped wasting time, right? They stopped wasting that energy. It's incredibly sad, right? Because they have learned that no one will come for them. Now, if we're looking at through the lens of interpersonal violence, when we have families that are experiencing violence in the home, how often are parents regulated enough that when a baby cries, they know the cry? How many of you have children? How many of you could tell the difference when you had babies between when they were wet and when they were tired and when they were hungry? Right? They have different cries. They tell us things differently. But if I'm in a space where I'm constantly worried about my own safety because I'm in danger all the time, or because I have been in danger all the time throughout my lifespan, whether or not I'm able to actually figure that out is pretty slim, right? I'm probably not going to be able to notice that as well. So next comes to autonomy. Can I do things independently? I do it, right? That's the 2-year-old's mantra, I do it. Or am I ashamed or am I doubtful about my abilities? So some of you may be familiar with something that we call the circle of security. This is when children, we see this circle, right? A toddler leaves us and goes to try something, but they do a lot of this. Like, are you still there, right? And they do this thing, whatever it is, and then they come back. Now, what if I don't have that circle of security, though? So what we see in children who never meet number one, in children who never get to trust, they live in the mistrust, we either see that they go and never look back, or they're just doing it on their own, or they never leave because they're fearful. So if we don't get through number one, we can't get to number two. And then we continue to miss milestones throughout our life that make it very difficult for us to independently do things on our own in a way that makes us feel proud and safe and secure. It's not always easy to consider like that these things that happened are harmful to our children. I want to stress that we will all make mistakes with children. We will all have moments when we don't go get them because they're crying and hungry, because we're exhausted, because we haven't slept in 72 hours or whatever. The discussion of this is when it's ongoing and no repair is occurring after the rupture. And so that's the important part as we talk about this. I really didn't want to have to stop to undo my water cap. But I don't want people to think that if there's one traumatic moment in a child's life that's it for them, right? There's going to be lots of moments. But it's how we repair the rupture. So brain development. Obviously, in utero, our brain starts at 0, right? And then we grow. Are any of you familiar with the Dutch famine cohort? So during World War II, the Nazis encircled a Dutch community and starved them out. Essentially, they decided not to go in and try to actually take over. They just waited them out. And so what we found, or what happened, was that women, well, everyone, was eating whatever they could. So literally dirt and rats and whatever was available to them because they were being starved out. And so in 1945, people started studying a group of women who were pregnant during this time period. And then they studied a group of women who were pregnant immediately after this time period. And they followed these children to the present. So anyone, they would be much older now, but they followed them from that time through the present. And what they found was that these children, as they aged, had serious deficits in a lot of areas, including that they had more heart issues. They had issues with nutrition, with both malnutrition and being overweight or obese. They had issues with heart complications. They had more experiences of cancer. They had all of these mental health issues that could not be explained in any other way other than during this period of gestation, their mothers were starving to death. So when we talk about brain development, we have to start at the beginning. So we look at nutrition. First thing we look at is the nutrition of a mother while she is pregnant. So if I am in the midst of a violent relationship where someone is abusing me, I don't know that I'm super concerned about whether or not I had all of my servings of vegetables today, right? I might be concerned about eating. I might not even be all that concerned about eating at all. I might turn to some unhealthy coping mechanisms, like using drugs or alcohol or eating unhealthy food in order to try to manage. Except that babies grow based on what's happening in their body. In the third trimester of pregnancy, a baby develops what we call the HPA axis, which is our hypothalamus, our pituitary gland, and our adrenal gland. Our hypothalamus and our pituitary gland are in our brain, and our adrenal gland is on our pancreas, and it's this little thing that releases adrenaline. So it's called the adrenal gland. And that HPA axis helps us with self-control regulation, particularly emotional regulation. So as you might be aware, when we're stressed out, our body releases stress hormones, cortisol and adrenaline. Now, cortisol and adrenaline are actually super important. If we look back to cavemen times, we were only anxious if someone was trying to kill us. So we needed adrenaline and cortisol to run faster. Unfortunately now, many of us become anxious and no one's trying to kill us, and so then our body just overproduces all these things. Cortisol is helpful when we are in danger. Cortisol and the stress hormones of adrenaline cross the placental barrier, and we create that HPA axis in our third trimester. So if we have women who are experiencing domestic violence during this third trimester, we are creating brains that are being grown in a soup of cortisol, which, as you can imagine, is not good. Because now we are producing brains that have never been calm, that have never known how it is to just be relaxed, and who've never known what it's like to just be able to believe that what's happening in their universe is okay. So now we have children who are being born with nutrition deficits, and we also have children who are being born with excess cortisol exposure. We all are familiar with drug exposure. Everybody knows drug exposure is bad. Cortisol exposure is not good either. If we have some cortisol exposure and it goes down, if you're in a car accident and then it goes down, we're okay, because a baby learns, right? We go up and we go down and we're okay. But if I'm constantly living in this state, then I'm going to have a problem. I'm going to be in trouble. In infancy, the brain is particularly important for productivity, cognition, and behavioral growth in the future. So essentially what this means is that first year of life, when we're talking about that first year of life, we need to have all of the nutrition and regulation that it can, because we use it as a building block. So I'm going to go to the next one. Influences on brain development. I have a lot of loves in my life. One of them is an inappropriate love for Lego sets. So I got a really big Lego train for my birthday this year. I was super happy. My mom thought it was ridiculous, but I don't even care. Brains are like Lego sets. We start at the bottom and we work our way up. If you've built a Lego set, the beginning part is not as fun, especially the big ones, because it's always like the ground floor of the building. It's not as exciting. If you're missing a piece, you can I know it's terrible when you're missing a piece. You can continue to go, but there's going to be a spot that's missing, right? And we can try to fix it with another piece or whatever, but there's still a spot that's missing and it still looks how it's not supposed to. And brains are kind of like that. We start at the bottom of our brain. We create our bottom brain first. So if you imagine your hand as a brain, your wrist is your brainstem right here. That's the part that tells you when you need to breathe. It tells you how to digest food. It tells your heart to beat. It tells you all these things that none of us ever actually know about. And that part develops first. Then the next part that develops is this inner part of our brain that we sometimes call our mammalian brain, which is the part that we share with all mammals, that houses our amygdala, gives us our fight, flight, or freeze response, tells our muscles when to react, tells our body when to react. And then lastly, we grow our frontal lobes, which is what makes us different from everyone else. So if you look at this brain model that I have, which by the way is twice as big as a normal brain, so if you're like, wow, that's really big, it's the brown part that comes up last. And that part actually continues to grow until you're about 25. Some researchers would say that it continues to grow until you're 30. So depending on what research you're reading, we know that it continues to grow. But that front part of our brain, that's the part of our brain that makes decisions, that makes thoughtful decisions. So our amygdala is super important, don't get me wrong. If I walked up to someone and went to punch them in the face, I need for them to react in a fight, flight, or freeze sort of way. So you're either gonna put your hand up, right, to block it, you're gonna fight it, you're gonna move your head to flee, or if you're like me, you'll probably sit still and just get punched in the face. I'm really hoping no one ever tries to punch me in the face. However, what we don't want to use there is that front part of our brain, because we don't want our front part of our brain to be like, all right, that fist is flying at my face at 2.4 miles per hour, and this is what I need to do next. So our amygdala is super important. But we don't want to make all of our decisions like that, right? We want to make decisions based on what we know. These parts of our brain grow through experience. What we work with, what we do, grows. If I go to the gym and I only lift weights on the left side of my body, only the left side of my body is going to grow. The right side of our brain holds our emotions, holds our trauma, holds our creativity. The left side of our brain holds all of our cognition. We have a special spot in our brain that tells us what to say. We have another spot called the Broca's area. We have a spot called the Wernicke area that tells us what someone is saying to us. It means I can hear it and I can interpret what is being said. The left side of our brain does all of our cognitive thinking. Generally speaking, both sides of our brain are not active at the same time. We activate one or we activate the other. So we build our right side first, because to some extent, babies don't actually need to know what you're saying. They can hear tone on the right side of their brain. So on the right side of our brain, we can hear tone, and that's what I need to know. But I need to grow the left side. And that takes all of these things that are important, like nutrition. Relationship with the mother/caregiver. Now, we generally use the term mother. We know that fathers are important. We know that sometimes babies go to live with other people, but their primary caregiver is the single most important relationship in a child's life, because that is their home base. That is their secure person. The third is consistent caregiver, nutrition, and regular access to engagement with others. In Romania, they did a ton of research in Romania shortly following the fall of communism in the late 80s, because they had an enormous amount of orphaned children. And when Westerners and Europeans do research, they bring money. So we did a lot of research on Romanian children. Romanian children got all of the nutrition that they needed. Those orphanages made sure that those babies had all of the nutrition that they needed. And yet they were smaller than other children, even in Romania. Other Romanian children, they were smaller, they were less developed, and they had more difficulty with learning disabilities later in life. So what was the difference? The difference was the caregiving. We actually have found that if we can even take children who have no parents and place them into homes where, for example, in Haiti, they tend to live in something that are called creches, which is where there is 1 to 2 parents who reside with the children and treat them like family until they are able to be adopted. We know that improves their functioning. It improves their physical growth. It improves their development, because relationship is important. Relationship is what helps us realize what's happening in the world. We can't separate out attachment from everything else. We all work together. Exposure to violence, including during the prenatal time period, is extremely detrimental to growth. So generally speaking, we're talking physical growth, we're talking emotional growth, and we're talking cognitive growth. So we see a lot of difficulty when we have children who are in this space. So we have to be honest. Interpersonal violence happens in all communities, in all races, in all genders, in all ethnicities, in everything. Now, sometimes it takes different forms. One thing that's important to understand is that I personally believe, and if others of you may or may not agree with me, that we under-report and under-identify emotional abuse as interpersonal violence. But emotional abuse and mental abuse or financial abuse, however you want to phrase it, is incredibly detrimental to a person's physical body, psyche, everything else. And so often we will say, well, there's not abuse in my community. And there may not be physical abuse that you can see, but there is abuse in your community. There is abuse in all of our communities. And what we know is that children who are exposed to violence early engage in violent behaviors when they get older. Because babies learn not just, we do this thing with our brain, we call it brain alignment. So some of you may be familiar with what we call our mirror neurons. Those are in our frontal lobes. If you go through the grocery store and the checker and you smile at the checker will smile back at you. Because our brain tells us, like, I want to look like that person. If you go through the checker and you're like this, they will also look like that. Even if they initially smile, they'll stop because they're like, what's wrong? The right side of our brain aligns with the right side of the brain that we're across from, particularly when we're in close relationship. So when we have infants whose mothers or primary caregivers, could be fathers, when we have infants whose mothers are dysregulated, unable to control themselves emotionally, or are being emotionally abused, guess what happens to that baby's right brain state? That baby's right brain state is all off a kilter, which isn't what we want. So, I want to define child abuse here very quickly because I think it's important. And sometimes we look at things a little bit differently. So physical abuse is pretty clear, right? Physical abuse is someone's hitting, slapping, punching, kicking, whatever. I don't, everybody has kind of differences of opinions about corporal punishment. I'm not going to touch that one with a 10-foot pole. So physical abuse, though, is harming a child or a person. Sexual abuse, unfortunately, I do work with children who are now children, but who as infants and toddlers were sexually abused. Sexual abuse is absolutely one of the most difficult for us to treat, particularly if that sexual abuse was done with the permission of or by someone who is close in our life. But emotional abuse and neglect are the two that I want to focus on because I feel like those are the two that we're really running into when we're talking about people who are in violent relationships. Emotional abuse is, generally speaking, means I have a parent who's not emotionally available for me. So some of us are super familiar, right? Know emotional abuse when I see it because it'd be somebody saying something mean to a child, you're stupid, I hate you, whatever. Those are true, that is true. But in terms of domestic violence, interpersonal violence, what we have is parents who are not emotionally available for their children. So when their child cries, the parent cannot comfort them because the parent is dysregulated. The parent is having their own emotional difficulties. When they have a child who needs someone to give them a high five for doing well on, they walked 3 steps or whatever, and the parent is completely not present, and so they don't give them the high fives. There's really 2 types of neglect. Well, there's really 3, but we're going to cover 2. One is something we might call malevolent neglect, and that is where a parent has the capability of caring for a child and they choose not to. So a good example story that I've heard before is, we have adolescents who are drinking alcohol. We bring parents in to treatment and we say, we need for you to lock up all of the alcohol that's in your home. And the parent says, listen, my kid needs to stop drinking. I'm not changing my life and embarrassing myself by having to lock up my alcohol because they can't control themselves. So that is a parent who has the capability of doing something and is choosing not to. We also have unintentional neglect, which is, I am so wrapped up in whatever is happening in my world that I cannot provide for my child. Now that might be emotionally, but it might also be physically. It might be that you don't get up in the morning to get your kid dressed for school, that you don't make sure that they're eating healthy food, that you don't focus on things like babies learn everything through doing, learn everything through their sensory world. So we are biologically driven to do certain things. If you've ever had a baby in front of you, I'm sure you've done this. Oh, hello, I'm so happy to see you. And then you take their little chubby legs and you run them back and forth because that's what we do with babies because that's what babies need. But if I have a parent who is unable to care for themselves, they're not going to do those things. They hopefully will go. I need to make sure I'm not like, I was doing a speech not too long ago and I accidentally called someone on my phone because Siri did that for me. I was like, thanks, Siri. All of a sudden, I was like, what's happening? So when we have parents who are unable to care for their children are not getting what they need, which is an unintentional neglect. None of what I'm saying is intended to shame anyone. I understand that many people who are engaged in relationships that are violent were themselves children in witnessing violent relationships, that they observed other people engaging in violent ways and believe that that's how life works. Or they're intending to recreate what happened to them in childhood because that's all they know. And so when we're talking about this, none of this is intended to shame, it's intended to show. Because the problem with this is our longer term outcomes. Relational trauma refers to traumatic experiences that are rendered with important relationships, particularly during early childhood. So when we have relational trauma, that could be that we are, as a parent, intentionally doing something to our child. It could be that we are allowing bad things to happen to our child, which unfortunately also often happens in relationships, in violent relationships, because unfortunately, it is rare that one parent will be extremely violent and abusive to a parent and not to a child. What we see is a lot of acting out behaviors. And we see them as one of two things. We see acting outwards and we see acting inwards. Most people can tolerate children who act inwards much better. We have a lot of compassion for 5-year-olds who sit in a corner and cry. We have a lot of feelings for the 5-year-old who just sits there and looks sad. We have less compassion for the 5-year-old who tries to punch you. I had a 5-year-old not too long ago pick up a big truck and throw it at my head and yell, "I am not mad!" Clearly, you are not mad. Mom, of course, jumped off the couch and apologized, and I said, hang on. Because just like if he had cried, that's all he was doing, right? He has no way of managing what's happening. 5-year-olds in general don't manage their emotions well, but 5-year-olds who've been through the kind of trauma that little man had been through, quite frankly, he deserved to throw big trucks at a lot of people, and we deserve to have compassion for him. Mentalization, 1, refers to my ability to understand how I think and feel. So, we teach children what they're feeling because we tell them what they're feeling. So when they cry, we say, "I know you're so sad, I'm so sorry." And when they throw a big truck at your head, you say, "I'm sorry that you're mad." Or "You're not mad, I'm sorry that you're mad that I said you were mad." And when they are worried about something, we say, "I'm so sorry that you're nervous about this." We teach them those feelings. But if I'm not focused on my child, I'm not focused on teaching them things. So I can't tell how I feel, and then I for sure can't tell how you feel. And to some extent, I don't care. I don't care how you feel because I actually don't see you as the same as me, because I am spending all of my time just trying to survive. So mentalization is something we see a lot of trouble with in people who have autism. People who are on the autism spectrum disorder tend to have difficulty with mentalization. Children and adults who were raised in homes of violence tend to have difficulty with mentalization because no one helped them to figure out how they were feeling, so they couldn't figure out how someone else was feeling. Narcissism, nobody likes that word. Narcissism as a definition, we're talking about adults. But narcissistic behavior, sometimes I will get parents, I love parents, I really do. But sometimes I'll get a parent of a 3-year-old who's like, they only care about themselves. And I'm like, right. When they're 10, if that's still happening, come back and talk to me. But we see, so what should happen in life is babies and children are narcissistic. I remember talking with a teenage girl who had been in and out of foster homes her whole life and whatnot, and she said to me, "I want to have a baby because then I'll have someone that loves me." And I said, "Oh, sweetheart, babies do not love you. You love babies. Babies don't love you. You might be their person, but you're their person because you are their person and you care for them. Babies are inherently narcissistic. We're supposed to be narcissistic, and then our narcissism drops off. But what happens when we see children who have been raised in homes of violence, who were born with their brains being bathed in a soup of cortisol, is that they remain narcissistic. They can only think about themselves. Sometimes this takes the shape of being extremely passive, trying to do whatever it takes to make you happy, because that keeps me safe. If you're not happy, then I'm unsafe. Sometimes it takes a lot of different forms. People often don't like the word narcissism, but it's a word. It's just a word. We give a lot of meaning to words that we don't need to. So, children who are born into homes where there's violence are at a significantly higher risk of psychopathology in childhood and in adulthood. They struggle with two primary things. One is emotional regulation. Emotional regulation refers to our ability to recognize what we're feeling and to regulate that emotion. So all of you, I shouldn't say all of you, maybe not. I should say, okay, I get up every day and go to the gym. And I really wish I was a better morning person. But every morning I wake up and go, oh, I really don't want to go. But I get up and I go because I know that's what I need to do, right? So I can regulate that emotion. If I could not regulate that emotion and I went, I don't feel like going, then I just wouldn't go. That's a very simple explanation, right? But that's exactly what it is. But we have this other part of our brain that handles all of our cognitions and our ability to make decisions. And when we have children who come from homes of violence, we see that they are unable to make decisions later in life. Now, part of that is because of a lack of emotional regulation, but part of it is because when I am over here living, which side's my right side? When I'm over here living in my trauma, this part of my brain goes offline. And I'm unable to figure out what I'm supposed to be doing. I do want to say that newborns whose mothers were exposed to IPV during pregnancy show difficulty with temperament, mood, approach, and withdrawal, which is we want children when they approach, we want for them to then what's the word I'm looking for? Nuzzle in. But what happens is they withdraw. So they approach as though they need something, but then they have difficulty withdrawing. Distractibility and persistence were significantly altered when compared to children of non-abused mothers. This is this is like the first 6 months after birth. So they had difficulty and altered cortisol levels, plasma glue, and GABA levels, all of which has to do with emotional regulation. So we know all of these things. Behavioral long-term goals, difficulty with self-control and self-regulation we talked about, difficulty with aggressive and violent behaviors, difficulty with healthy attachments. Without treatment, without treatment or change, what happens to us in childhood is what we live in adulthood. So if I see violence and I engage in violence in childhood and that never resolves, then I engage in violence in adulthood. Something happens when people turn 18 that we suddenly think that you're on your own. So at 17 and 360 days, we're like, oh, that's so sad for that child. And then at 18 and 1 day, we're like, get over it. You're responsible for yourself. I don't know what happened in the last 4 days, but we see these long-term outcomes when these things happen to us when we're little. Now, I'm not at all saying that we should excuse behaviors. I talk a lot about the difference between an explanation and an excuse. I'm working on my PhD right now in psychology. And my research is focused around attachment and violence, particularly just exploring whether or not adoption acts as a mediator for violent behavior later in life. And I communicate with quite a few adopted individuals who murdered their adoptive parents, who are currently incarcerated. And the amount of vitriol that they get, I understand from family because they murdered someone in almost all cases for no apparent reason. But they're still people, and they're still humans, and they were still babies that were injured, and they engaged in a behavior that's not okay. But when we look at adults and view them this way, when we look at perpetrators of violence and look at them only as perpetrators of violence and not as probably also victims of violence when they were young, then we miss out on an opportunity. We miss out on an opportunity to make real change. They have difficulty with people in positions of authority, obviously, because the people in positions of authority in their life are not safe. And we tend to have the cycle continue, especially if we don't have treatment. So, there are 4 therapeutic treatments that I'm going to talk about. These are the 4 therapeutic treatments that are most commonly researched with regards to PTSD. Now, one of the uncommon opinions that I hold, or unlikable opinions that I hold, is that diagnoses get in the way, because many of the children that I work with don't actually qualify for a diagnosis of PTSD for a variety of reasons, but they're still clearly traumatized. And so there is a push by some in the trauma community to create a diagnosis related to developmental trauma, relational trauma. We don't have that yet. What we do have is these 4 really great treatments that do work with children who have PTSD. And the middle 2, TBRI and Theraplay, have both been extensively researched in children who were adopted or who have come from orphanages. So, EMDR, I'm going to do these relatively quickly so that I can try to make sure I have time at the end for questions. EMDR refers to eye movement desensitization reprocessing. This was created in the late 1970s, which in the world of therapy then means it's like a newer therapy. But it was created because what was happening was we were having Vietnam veterans come home from Vietnam, and they were doing things like assaulting and harming their partners while they were sleeping. And what was happening was they were having a dream. They woke up and they were having a flashback, and they felt that they were in danger and they were harming their partner because they thought their partner was dangerous. Here's the problem with flashbacks. Flashbacks are not dreams. During a flashback, your brain believes it's happening again. So I am being re-traumatized every time. So EMDR rewires those pathways. Nothing is going to make this trauma go away. Nothing is going to have made what happened in Vietnam any better, or any of the trauma that we talk about. What EMDR does is EMDR allows the right side of the brain and the left side of the brain to be activated at the same time, so that the left side of the brain can say to the right side of the brain, that did happen, it was terrible, and you are okay. It is not happening right now. So that's the super simple explanation of it. TBRI stands for Trust-Based Relational Intervention, which also came out of Texas Christian University. It focuses on the 3 pillars of trauma-informed care: structure, engagement, and nurture. So TBRI acts as both something we can do in a therapy office, as well as something parents do at home, as well as something schools do in schools. It is very helpful in helping to regulate and attach. Theraplay was created out of the University of Chicago, and focuses on 4 pillars, which are very similar. The final pillar, structure, engagement, nurture, and they throw in challenge. So the point of challenge is to help with self-efficacy, to help with a child to feel as though they are competent, because one of the things we see in children who come from trauma is that they do not feel competent. They do not feel they can protect themselves, because in all honesty, they weren't able to, but we want them to know that now. And then finally, trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy. So this is a particular form of CBT. It is generally done in about 18 sessions. It focuses on creating a coherent narrative, sharing that narrative with a parent. During the time the child is creating the narrative, the parent is also receiving treatment so they can learn how to appropriately respond to hearing about their child being traumatized. And the idea then is that I have a coherent narrative, and I'm able to explain that to someone who can accept it and engage in it. You'll notice the bottom 3, TBRI, Theraplay, and TFCBT, are all attachment focused. EMDR is focused on rewiring. So the bottom 3 also work on rewiring. But all of these are very specifically focused on brain development and attachment, because that's what we are looking for. There are other things that have found to be very helpful for people who've endured chronic trauma. Things like yoga, somatic healing is coming back online. I do believe that there is a discussion today about the use of psychedelics in the treatment of trauma, because psychedelics help bypass our fear response and make us more available to other things. So there are a lot of options, but because we study what we have diagnoses for, we study PTSD. And so that's what we have treatments for, even though there are obviously people who do not meet the criteria of PTSD. So I left a few minutes for questions. Does anybody have any questions? Yes?
I often work with people who are the adults who experience these things.
Yes.
So I do often, because I work on a shorter-term basis, I do often refer to EMDR, but also accelerated, and then CPT.
Yes.
But I see for kids with the attachment. So my question is, if you're working with adults, is it, if some of these other, the other ones, like not just EMDR, but like early resolution therapy or CPT, or TFCPT also.
So the question was, when we're working with adults who were the victims as children, we know that certain treatments work, including EMDR, but there's also some other treatments, including CPT and some other things. So TFCBT has been widely studied up to 24 years old, but that's really the maximum. Initially it was 3 to 18. Now they've sort of pushed that, I think, just because we realized developmentally we're seeing some delays. But I will say that both TBRI and Theraplay are very much focused on children. Theraplay, to some extent, really only up until about age 14. We can modify some of those things. I use all 4 of those practices in my own practice. We can modify some of them to work. But for the most part in that list, EMDR is probably the one that's most appropriate for adults. Yeah. Yes?
Back to brain development in utero, you were talking about the cortisol adrenaline release in the 3rd trimester. Is there significant impact in the other trimesters as well, or is it really specific to that 3rd trimester?
So there is impact, just because it's not what, like, what's the word I'm looking for? Like, it's not the soup we want our babies born in. But because the 3rd trimester is when we produce that left side of our brain and when we really develop that HPA axis, that's why it's so detrimental during that time period. But it is harmful previously, but we know that that's probably the most detrimental time period. Yes, yes. Oh, and I don't think I repeated that question, which was, we know that trauma is bad during the 3rd trimester of pregnancy. Is it harmful during the first 2 trimesters? Yes.
One of our online attendees asks, would violent movies and or video games in early childhood and toddler years also fall into the violence that you mentioned earlier?
So the question was, would violent movies and video games in early childhood and toddlerhood impact someone in the same way that violence does? And someone really wants for me to say something quite controversial. Personally, I believe that violence in general is not healthy for us to take in. Now, personally, I am a person who believes that what we put into our body is what exudes from our body, and I think we see that. So if you look at people in our life, when we see people who do a lot of things like guided meditation and who listen to positive things and who do those positive things in their life, they tend to feel more positively without making someone who, I don't know, owns a video game company like stalk me in my sleep. I can't speak directly to that, but in my opinion, violence is violence. When we have violence in our home and in our life and towards us or towards those we love, it is particularly harmful. But violence is violence, and so it's probably not helpful. Yes?
Have you noticed a difference in children raised by mothers who or parents who are depressed versus children raised by parents who have this emotional and personal abuse where the abuse is happening in the home and there is a lack of parental engagement with emotions, which is also happening to mentally depressed caregivers, but there's no violence?
That's a really good question. I don't have research on that, and I tend to like to say things that I have research on just because it makes me feel better and makes me feel more like I'm giving good information. I can say from my personal experience, because I do work with children, that what I notice is that as they get older, children who have mothers who are depressed or who have caregivers who are depressed and thus emotionally unavailable tend to be more forgiving because they start to realize as they get older that the parent is doing the best that they can. However, in that childhood time period, I don't know that it matters to them because what they know is the parent is not available to them. Yes?
I was curious what that third type of neglect was. You mentioned there was 3, but you were going to talk about 2. You talked about math.
Oh, the third. Okay, so she asked about what 3 types of neglect there are. There's one that, depending on what phrasing you want to use, is what we would term societal neglect. And so it actually is referencing when people are living in poverty. So it's an unintentional neglect by the parent. It's not intended to harm the child, but the child is actually being physically neglected because they're not receiving the nutrients that they need, nutrition. They don't have showers. They don't have parents who can help them with school and those kinds of things. But it's termed societal neglect, generally speaking. Mm-hmm. Other questions? Okay. Yeah, thank you guys. Before you go, he's going to give you the word for this.
Yeah, so just real quick, thank you very much, Victoria, for sharing your knowledge and skills with us today. To all of our participants, if you need to earn CEUs for attending the presentation, please be sure to complete the CEU quiz on the online portal. And the code word for this session is develop. And our next session will start in about 15 minutes. Thank you.